my name's Dan. I'm 40 something years of age, the later half of my 40th decade. I live in Solihull and I work for the local authority in children's services, and I attend a church called Solihull Presbyterian Church. My very early Christian life, I didn't know much about anything really. Because of my childhood, I had a bit of a bumpy ride, to say the least. I won't go into too much detail, but it did involve some not very pleasant times in my family. I came to become a Christian. I came to Christ at 16, but those first few years were very intense, I suppose. I came to recognise that God was definitely on my case, as it were, was bringing me to a greater knowledge of him, but it was all part of a journey which I suppose I've come to recognise now as being important, even though it was extremely painful at the time. I was very emotionally vulnerable, I was very confused, I was very lonely. I couldn't make friendships easily, I was a bit of a loner. I tended to do a lot of things on my own, to be forced to come out and do things with other people and that sort of thing. I potentially could have gone down a different route, and I suppose, and if I could sum it up, I wouldn't be here now if I hadn't become a Christian. So I think my relationship with the Lord is as the Queen would say, my mainstay, and has sustained me for quite a long time now, for the last 30 years. So yeah, I ended up at Renewal, and I'd say ended up. I think there was a purpose for me going there. And in the very early days, I found this very large church, but the core of the church was made up of some very solid people, and it was under the ministry of David Carr at the time. This is the first time I'd ever been to a church of this size, and on the whole, the preaching was quite biblically based. It was quite evenly led. I think that the life of the church was quite vibrant, and I think for that particular point in my life, I think it fulfilled a need. I think I was supposed to be there for that time. Towards the end of my time at Renewal, I think I identified it as the fact I needed more biblically based teaching, and in the early days there was that, but I think the more I looked into it, the more I realised that I wasn't being fed, that I needed something more meaty, something more substantial based on the Word of God. I needed to learn more about what being a Christian was about, what it should be. And now, in the position that I am now, and where I am now, I recognise that I didn't really know much about the character of God, what he really did, what salvation really was, what redemption was, what Christ really did. That was lacking, I feel, at Renewal at the time, and I think that was, and I've been disgruntled for a number of years, and I just wasn't settling. There's a lot of charismatic stuff and Pentecostal stuff going on there, people talking in tongues and everything, and I was never really that comfortable with that sort of thing. So, I don't want to belittle the church and everything. I think there's a lot of good people still there, but I just don't think the word is preached. I don't think the gospel is proclaimed either. So, as the gospel, as I've come to recognise it, about about the person and the works of Jesus Christ, this so-called Reformed theology, actually had a real substantial historical basis, in the fact that it was founded from the Reformation, and the more I began to look at it and the more I heard about it, then I began to realise that, well, this has to be the truth. And I wasn't going to Renewal by that point because I just didn't want to go there, because the thought of going there was just. But at the same time, I didn't really want to make this leap into this unknown thing either, and so it caused me a lot of conflict. And I thought, I can't keep going on like this. I can't keep subjecting myself to this amount of chaos, I suppose. So So I think that's what spurred me on to make the decision to leave Renewal, have my final appointment with Dave Carr, and then left and cut my ties with the church, and then started attending Solihull Pres. I went to SPC and thinking, it's a smaller crowd. The first thing I obviously noticed was it was smaller, but the people there are a lot more relational, and I think with a smaller congregation, you have a lot more of an ability to be a lot more personable and to relate to people. I mean, obviously, I felt in those first few times I felt quite nervous. The second thing was I was struck how much simpler the service was. It wasn't produced or managed. There was a sort of more natural flow to it in a way, but there was also structure. Another thing that I had that really started to irritate me about modern worship at Renewal was, and in other churches as well, was that all the songs were just Jesus this, Jesus that, and repeat the thing over and over and over again. There was no substance to the songs or the hymns or whatever you want to call them, and a lot of it was very I-centred. And I felt that was not, and I knew enough to know that God needs to be worshipped for who he is, and have a sense of raw reverence and awe and respect for God and for his person and who he really is. If you sing all these songs that just go on about people and our needs and this, and you meet us in our needs and everything, but what about worshipping God for who he is? So that was something that struck me about Solihull Presbyterian, that they sung some very good old-fashioned hymns that I think meant more. I think the very words, I think I started to, I mean, the only accompaniment we have at SBC is a piano, or we did at the time before lockdown and everything, and it was a much more simpler way of doing it, but a much freer in many ways, because then you were able to concentrate on the words in the hymn. And then what really impressed me as well was the way that the communion is held. It's treated with reverence. It's one Sunday every month. It's treated with reverence and respect, and you come in a very non-flippant manner. You come to the table, to the communion table, in full respect of Christ and recognising what communion is, and it's a memorial of what Christ did for us, and recognising that we can come no other way than in simple obedience. And then a fellowship supper as well, fellowship lunch. I think that's one of the other things that really impressed me as well, and everybody in the church is encouraged to serve in one way or another, to get involved, setting out the chairs, to putting them away, to putting out the tables and chairs for the fellowship meal, to putting them away, doing the washing up, bringing food, and also a midweek meeting where the Bible is. There's more Bible study. No, quite apart from in addition to the teaching on a Sunday, you get more instruction in the week as well, and encouraged to come to that as your reasonable service. And I think the thing I began to learn when I first got there is that worship isn't just on a Sunday. Worship is the way we live our lives. And I began to learn that. And I think that as I began to come under Stephen's teaching, and I began to recognise that I think most of all is the special nature of the Lord's Day. The Lord's Day should be set apart, where the fellowship, where the body of the church meet together and meet in fellowship. And I've come to really recognise that as a valuable time. And whereas before at Renewal it didn't really bother me if I turned up or not. I put it on my scorecard if I did. Whereas now, and I know we're in the COVID situation, and we do other things on Zoom, but being able to meet in the park again all together, okay, we're all spaced out in our zones and everything. I think we've all missed that. And being able, and I think that's more what I've come to value more than anything, is the meeting of the body, and not to frown upon it, not to do away with it, not to avoid it. But that's what the church is. We're all together. Together we are the church, and Christ is our cornerstone and the head of our church. And then also the invisible church that links us to every other Christian on the planet. And things like, I've many scriptures I've heard for years. The Beatitudes, the parables that Jesus taught, and even, those have taken on new meaning. Paul's epistles, his letters to the Romans, to the Hebrews, to even bits I'm learning about Revelation, for instance. That's not this super spiritual book of mysteries. It's actually written as an encouragement to Christians, but also learning how the New Testament is very powerfully linked to the Old Testament, and that everything in the Old Testament happened according to a plan, that not only do we have the Old Covenant, we have the New Covenant. The one did not do away with the other, but the one completed the other as well. Learning the law of the Lord, the law of God, the Ten Commandments, and there's that, and there's so many other things. And then under the teaching I've had both from Stephen and Falco, and going to a conference, and the absolutely rich resources I've discovered that are out there in the world. You're talking about Ligonier, you're talking about Grace to You, the Paul Washer, and many other pastors and learned teachers and theologians who've embraced the Word of God and who just teach solidly from the Word. I've learned so many different things, and I'm still learning now. I mean, even the just the knowledge that the coming of Christ was foretold so many times in the Old Testament, and that there were glimpses of him all the way through, that everything from Genesis to the first Adam to the second Adam to, there's just so many things I could list and probably forgotten and then remember again. That it's just been liberating. It really has. And then coming to recognise that the absolute 100% job that God did through the coming of Christ, through his absolute nature of being fully God yet fully human, and being perfect in both aspects. But he's just done absolutely everything we need. I mean, the fact that, and I know a lot of people have difficulties on believing that, that Christ doesn't come for just everyone who just make a decision to follow him or not. It's actually the fact that he chose whom he will save before he created this entire world and the whole universe. He's chosen a set amount of people to be his people, and just realising that as well. I mean, I've heard of divine election before, and I'd heard it said a few years ago and things like that. I'm not really giving it much thought, but then I think out of all of that, that's the easiest thing I've found to embrace, because I've heard about it before. Because Paul has said it several times through his letters, and I've read those letters, and Paul, the Apostle Paul, even though I don't know that much about him, I've still got so much to learn, has been quite an example and an encouragement to me, even living the single life. And that's another thing I've learnt about the single life as well, but I won't bore you with that one. But just coming to realise that Christ has done everything we need, and that he does everything that we need him to do, and that he's chosen us all anyway, and that I don't have to do a single thing except obey him and study the Word and follow him. He's done everything else, because we can't do anything ourselves. We ourselves, and that's another thing I've learned, we have nothing to offer him to further our own salvation. Again, he did it all, and God has just thought of everything. He planned everything, he thought everything. He knows what I'll do for the whole of my life. He knows what I need before I even open my mouth. He just knows everything, and I find that mind-blowing. And I didn't get any of that at renewal. And the freedom it brings. Okay, this body, our bodies, are wretched, but compared to the awesomeness of Christ, and that he is the image of the eternal God. That how did I think it was Michael Reeves recently, he's a teaching fellow at Ligonier, he recently put it, Adam and Eve were the original image of God, but then the fall into sin destroyed that image. But Christ then came and began to restore that image to put onto humanity, because humanity originally would have its full expression through God, through Christ himself. And the fact that he is everything we need is all summed up in him. He is the ultimate end, the ultimate beginning, and that is just, wow. So whenever I'm down, I'll just think of that and wow, you're off. I've been at SBC now for 3 years, and I've been a member for, it's got to be 2 years now. And I was at Renewal for 13 years, and in the early times, yes, the preaching was quite good, but it makes you think. But they have the same Bible as us. They have access to the same materials. They don't preach the word. They don't preach the gospel itself. I mean, Renewal, I think at last count they were saying they're going to raise money to build a worship centre and things like that. That's not what people need. What people need is the good news. And the good news of Christ is the gospel. And if you preach the gospel, okay, you're going to get lots of opposition. You're going to get slandered. You're going to get things. But Christ himself said, Jesus himself said, we will encounter persecution, we'll encounter harassment. But that's not what's happening at places like Renewal. It's not just Renewal, it's other places as well. They've lost sight of the fact that Christ is the centre of everything we do. That it's the good news about his coming, about his nature and his person, and what he did, and what he does in people's lives, that is sorely lacking. And I think it was that lack of instruction and preaching that in the last few years of being there that I needed to hear, and I didn't. And it's sad in a way, because if that was going on there, I probably wouldn't have left. But I think the Lord knew, and he knows what I needed. And I think the sad indictment is that if you don't preach the gospel, people don't get challenged. And if you just put on presentations as a crowd puller, you're going to get loads of unsaved people in the church who just are still heading for a one-way train to eternal damnation and for judgment. And that's very sad. I think that's very sad. Whereas, if you hear the unadulterated gospel, there's one of two things: you either say yes or no. But at least you know where you are, and there's only two sides of the fence you can be on. And I think it was also a sad indictment that Dave Carr himself said a few years ago from the front. I wouldn't be surprised, he said, if less than 20% of you in here right now, and there's probably about nearly 1,000 people in there, are actually saved, truly repented of their sins, truly regenerated, and had their heart of stone taken away and had a heart of flesh put in place instead, and truly have their names written in the Lamb's Book of Life, which actually, by the way, this is another thing I really learned, was written before all of this began. All of us, though he determined to save, have our names in the book. If people are in that situation where they're questioning where they are, the things they're hearing from the front of their church just doesn't sit right with them. If there's something within them, within their spirit, within their soul that says this isn't right, then I would say to them, look for a place, for a church where the gospel's preached, where the minister and the elders are faithful expositors of the word of God, where they've had good foundational teaching themselves, where they've had a good theological base and just preach the word. None of the gizmos and gadgets that the contemporary church seems to fall back on. And I'm not just talking about Renewal, I'm talking about the universal church at the moment that seems to fall back on all this sort of stuff. But just talk to people who have been through this process themselves, and you can see the change in them. You can see what difference it's made in them. Every fulfillment of our lives rests in him. Just just explore it. Have an open mind and explore it. Don't be afraid either. And I think that's something that I and probably other people who've been through this have probably had as well. I've just felt afraid of it. It can seem like a big black cloud. It's not this ominous thing. It's not. I must admit, life doesn't change. The Christian life doesn't change. You'll still have problems. You'll still have the same issues. But the one thing you do have, which eclipses everything else, is that absolute assurance that Christ has you in the palm of his hand. And just ask people, if you know people who've been through this and have come out the other side and they are a million miles away from where they were, just talk to them and just rely on their honesty and their integrity.